There is a photograph from April 1956 that has never stopped circulating. A young woman in a gown so extraordinary that designers still study it today, walking through the ancient stone corridors of a palace older than America itself, about to become the princess of a country smaller than most American shopping malls. She had come from Philadelphia. She had come from brick money and iron discipline, and the particular kind of American ambition that doesn't apologize for wanting things. She was 26 years old, and she was giving up everything she had built with her own hands, everything she had fought for against a father who didn't believe in her, everything she had earned in the years when she paid her own rent in New York on a model's income and took acting lessons and dreamed about stages. She was giving all of it up for a crown, for a palace, for a prince who needed her in ways that the romance novels of the era were never quite honest about. But here is what the photograph does not show. It does not show the sister standing in that cathedral who would spend the next 3.5 decades watching her own life come apart in slow and mostly invisible pieces. It does not show the youngest sister who stayed home, who buried her husband and her daughter in the same year and got up the next morning anyway. It does not show the father who paid $2 million to make the marriage happen, while telling everyone in Philadelphia that his daughter didn't need to pay any man to marry her. It does not show the palace's courtiers watching the American family with an expression that in any language translates roughly as, "These people are not what we expected." There were 3 sisters in that Philadelphia family. One became a princess. The others lived lives just as dramatic, and in many ways far more human, far more painful, and far more honest about what the world actually does to the people it does not choose to celebrate. This is the story of all of them. The house on Henry Avenue. To understand the Kelly sisters, you have to understand the house. Not as a building, but as a force. The Kelly family home at 3901 Henry Avenue in East Falls sat on a hill in the northwest of Philadelphia, perched above the Schuylkill River like something that had earned its view. Jack Kelly built it in 1929. The same year, Grace was born, and he built it out of brick because bricks were the material that had made the Kellys rich, and Jack Kelly was the kind of man who never let you forget where the money came from. The house had 17 rooms, a swimming pool in the back, which was not common in East Falls in 1929, a tennis court, the kind of garden that Margaret Kelly tended with the same focused discipline she applied to everything else in her life. The neighborhood was comfortable, established, Irish Catholic in its social texture, and proud of it. But the Kelly house was something more than comfortable. It was a statement about who they were and where they intended to go, built in the materials of their own industry, sitting on a hill, in a neighborhood that knew exactly what the Kellys had done to get there and respected them for every brick of it. John Brendan Kelly Sr. was one of the most remarkable self-made men in 20th century American history, and he was thoroughly aware of that fact in ways that could be simultaneously inspiring and exhausting to anyone who had to live with him. He was born in 1889, the 7th of 10 children of Patrick Henry Kelly and Mary Ann Costello, Irish immigrants from County Mayo in the west of Ireland, people who had come to America with very little and built a life through physical labor, Catholic faith, and the particular ferocity that immigrant families of that generation brought to the project of becoming American. Patrick Kelly worked in a foundry. The family did not have money. What they had was each other, and a collective understanding that the only way up was through work, through relentless forward motion, through the refusal to accept that the conditions you were born into were the conditions you had to remain in. Jack Kelly grew up in that understanding. He was apprenticed as a bricklayer in his older brother Walter's construction company, learning the trade from the foundation up, literally, with his hands in mortar, understanding how a building comes together one course of brick at a time. He was also, from his earliest youth, an athlete of exceptional gifts. He swam, he boxed, he played football. He had the build of a man who had been formed by physical labor and who brought to athletic competition the same total physical commitment that he brought to everything else. But it was rowing that claimed him. rowing on the Schuylkill River below the neighborhood where he had grown up. In the single sculls, with a combination of technical skill and raw power that began attracting serious attention before he was 20 years old. In 1919, after serving as a first lieutenant in the United States Army Corps of Engineers during the First World War, a period during which he reportedly did not lose a single boxing match in regimental competition, Jack Kelly did what ambitious men of his generation did when they had learned enough to stand on their own. He started a company. John B. Kelly, Inc. was established with $7,000 borrowed from his brothers George and Walter, and from the very beginning, it was built on relationships. Jack Kelly had spent his youth among the tradesmen, the bricklayers, the construction crews of Philadelphia. He understood those men from the inside. He knew how to lead them because he had been one of them. Within a decade, Kelly for Brickwork was one of the largest construction firms on the eastern seaboard, with contracts spanning some of the most significant structures in Philadelphia's mid-century expansion. The business would eventually be valued at many millions of dollars. And it would make Jack Kelly, the bricklayer's apprentice from East Falls, into one of the most powerful men in Democratic Party politics in Pennsylvania. He ran for mayor of Philadelphia in 1935 and lost by fewer than 40,000 votes in an era when the Republican machine in that city was nearly impregnable. He was considered seriously as a vice presidential candidate in 1944. He was friends with Franklin Roosevelt and moved through the upper circles of American political life with the ease of a man who had earned his place there and who was not impressed by anyone else's credentials. But before all of that came the rowing. Before the money and the politics and the house on Henry Avenue, there was the river. And there was a story that became the founding myth of the entire Kelly family. The story that explains more about the air those children breathed than any other single fact about them. In 1920, Jack Kelly was at the peak of his competitive rowing career. He had won 126 consecutive sculling races, a record that stood for years, and he was preparing to enter the Diamond Challenge Sculls at the Henley Royal Regatta on the Thames in England, the most prestigious single sculls event in the world. The Henley Regatta had been held since 1839. It was, and remains, one of the great social events of the English summer season, a place where the Edwardian upper class came to row and to be seen, where the rules of entry were written to reflect the particular values of a social order that believed in the natural superiority of gentlemen. These rules were not subtle. They were written down in black and white in the steward's conditions of entry, and they stated with a clarity that left no room for interpretation that any man who had ever been engaged in manual labor for compensation was ineligible to compete, because such a man was by definition not a gentleman, and the Henley Regatta was not a place for men who were not gentlemen. The stewards of the Henley Regatta rejected Jack Kelly's application. The official explanation given was a procedural dispute with his rowing club, the Vesper Boat Club of Philadelphia, which had been banned from Henley competition following an earlier controversy about the amateur status of one of its members. But the widely understood, widely discussed, widely reported real reason was simpler and uglier. Jack Kelly was Irish, he was Catholic, he was the son of immigrants. He had spent years working as a bricklayer, a manual laborer, a man who had used his hands to earn money, and the Henley stewards had decided, collectively and deliberately, that Jack Brendan Kelly was not their kind, and therefore not the kind of man who should be competing in their race. Jack Kelly went to the 1920 Summer Olympics in Antwerp instead. On the afternoon of August 26, 1920, in a single afternoon that became one of the great revenge narratives in American sports history, he won the gold medal in the single sculls, and then won a second gold medal in the double sculls alongside his cousin, Paul Costello. His opponent in the single sculls final was Jack Beresford of Great Britain, who had won the diamond sculls at Henley that same summer. The race Kelly had been prevented from entering. Kelly beat him by a single second, on a river in Belgium, in front of the world. After the race, Kelly removed the red cap he had worn during competition. He folded it carefully, and he mailed it to King George V at Buckingham Palace. The note he included was short. Its precise wording has been reported differently across the decades, but its meaning has never been disputed. It was a message from a man who had been told he wasn't good enough, delivered to the symbolic head of the institution that had made that determination. It was neither angry nor graceless. It was simply final. He won another gold medal at the 1924 Paris Olympics in the double sculls, again with Paul Costello, becoming the first rower in Olympic history to win 3 gold medals. He was inducted into the Philadelphia Sports Hall of Fame, the United States Rowing Hall of Fame, and the United States Olympic Hall of Fame. The stretch of Kelly Drive along the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, the road where his son Kel would one day die jogging, was named in his honor while he was still alive. That was Jack Kelly. That was the story the family told about itself, the story the children heard from the time they were old enough to understand what it meant, the story that established the baseline expectations of what a Kelly was supposed to be capable of when the world told them no. You didn't argue, you didn't plead, you found another competition. You won it so completely that the people who had excluded you had no choice but to acknowledge what they had lost by their own smallness. It was a magnificent story. It was also an extraordinarily heavy inheritance for 4 children who were still trying to figure out who they were. Margaret Madger Kelly and the woman who shaped them all. If Jack Kelly was the legend, Margaret Madger Kelly was the force. She has received far less attention in the popular tellings of the Kelly story, which is its own form of injustice, because in many ways she was the more complicated figure, and the one whose influence on her daughters was more direct, more daily, and more lasting in ways that neither of them could entirely escape. Margaret Catherine Major was born in 1898, the daughter of Karl Major and Margaretha Semmelbauer, German immigrants who had settled in Philadelphia. She grew up in a household that valued education and physical discipline, with the seriousness common among immigrant families who understood that performance was the only currency available to people who had not arrived with money or connections. She was a gifted competitive swimmer. She was academically serious, and in 1931, she became the first woman ever to coach women's athletics at the University of Pennsylvania. A position that tells you everything about both her capabilities and her willingness to occupy spaces that women were not traditionally expected to inhabit. She did not ask permission. She prepared. She competed. She got there. She married Jack Kelly in 1924 after a courtship that was by all accounts passionate and tested, and together they built the house on Henry Avenue and the family that lived in it. She was, by the photographs that survive from her youth, strikingly beautiful in the strong, classical way that certain faces possess. But she was not a woman who traded on appearance. Beauty was not the point. Achievement was the point. Forward motion was the point. The Kelly household expected performance. In school, in athletics, in social grace, in presentation, in every area of life that could be measured. The bar was set at the level that Jack Kelly's own extraordinary story had established, which was a bar that most families would not have attempted to reach, let alone maintained as the daily standard. What this produced in the 4 Kelly children was a spectrum of responses that maps almost perfectly onto what we now understand about high-achieving, high-pressure family environments. One child thrived under the expectation and let it propel her beyond anyone's predictions. One bent to it and served it and eventually broke under its accumulated weight in ways that took decades to fully reveal. One found a way to satisfy it while building a life that was genuinely and quietly her own. And one left, spectacularly, completely, and at enormous personal cost, spending the rest of her life trying to understand what she had both escaped and lost. 4 children, and the weight of the family name. Margaret Catherine Kelly, known to everyone as Peggy, was born on June 13, 1925. She was the eldest, and from the beginning she was, by most accounts, the one with the most natural charisma. People who knew the Kelly family in the 1930s and 1940s, and who later encountered Grace after she became famous, almost universally described Peggy as the more immediately striking of the 2 older sisters. More vibrant, more socially alive. The kind of presence that fills a room before she has said a single word, that makes people turn toward her the way sunflowers turn toward light, not because she was performing or demanding attention, but simply because she was there. And being there was something she did with a completeness that drew people in. She was also, without any question, her father's favorite child. Jack Kelly was not a man who concealed his preferences, and his preference for Peggy was one of those family truths that everyone knew and nobody quite discussed, because discussing it would have required acknowledging the hierarchy it implied for the others. She was the firstborn. She was the one who most effortlessly moved through the social world that Jack Kelly valued, the world of Philadelphia politics and charity, and the Democratic Party's network of Irish Catholic families who formed the backbone of the city's power structure. She charmed rooms in the Kelly tradition, which meant with genuine warmth rather than calculated effect. She remembered names and faces and the particular things that mattered to particular people. She was the Kelly who seemed destined for the brilliant future, a good marriage, a prominent life. The continuation of everything the family had worked so hard to build. John Brendan Kelly Jr. Kell was born May 24, 1927. He was the son, the only son, and in the Kelly family hierarchy that carried a weight requiring no explanation. He was the one who would carry the athletic legacy forward, the one who would add another chapter to the story of Jack Kelly and the Schuylkill River. He did exactly that. Kell rode with the technical refinement and competitive intensity of someone who had absorbed his father's lessons so completely that they had become his own instincts. He won the Diamond Challenge Sculls at Henley in 1947, competing in the race his father had been prevented from entering a generation earlier, and winning it, making the family story's circle complete in a way that Jack Sr. never quite managed to treat as complete, because there was always one more standard to meet. Kell competed in the Olympic Games 4 times, winning a bronze medal at Melbourne in 1956. He later became president of the United States Olympic Committee and ran for mayor of Philadelphia in 1979. He was, by every measure, a remarkable man. He was also a man who spent his entire life operating in the shadow of a father whose shadow was almost impossible to emerge from. And most people who knew him understood that this was the central unarticulated fact of his existence. Grace Patricia Kelly was born on November 12, 1929, the third child, the second daughter, the middle child in almost every sense of that phrase. She was quiet, where the family was loud, introspective, where the family valued extroversion. She suffered from sinusitis through much of her childhood, which gave a nasal quality to her voice that she would later work deliberately and methodically to correct when she began training as an actress. She read books when the other children played sports. She preferred the company of dolls and imaginary worlds to the competitive rough and tumble of the Kelly backyard. She watched the world more than she participated in it, taking things in and processing them in some interior space that was distinctly her own and distinctly not understood by a father who believed that what happened inside a person was only valuable if it eventually came out as some form of measurable achievement. She was the child her father found most puzzling. He loved her in the way that Jack Kelly loved all of his children, which was real and present and occasionally overwhelming, but always filtered through his own measures of what constituted a worthwhile life. And by those measures, the quiet girl who wanted to be an actress did not immediately compute. Acting was not, in Jack Kelly's understanding of the world, a serious profession. It was something people did when they lacked the discipline or the talent to do something real. The fact that his own brother George was a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright did not significantly alter this view, because George had always been the different one, the one who had established his differentness as part of his identity before Grace came along and needed permission to be different herself. There was one figure in Grace's childhood who understood her in a way her father did not, and that was George Kelly. Jack's older brother was a playwright of real distinction, a man of brilliant theatrical intelligence, who took the stage seriously as a place where truth could be told, and who recognized in his niece something the rest of the family was slower to see. He saw the inner life. He saw the quality of attention, the capacity for observation and transformation, the ability to inhabit another person's experience completely enough to render it truthfully, that the best actors possess and that no conservatory training in the world can produce in someone who doesn't begin with it. He encouraged her. He lent her plays to read. He talked to her about theater with the seriousness he would have given any adult who shared the interest, which was not the way most adults in the Kelly world talked to a quiet girl who wanted to be on stage when the family expected her to be something else. Grace said later in life that her Uncle George was the person who made her believe that her artistic impulses were worth pursuing, that they were a legitimate form of ambition rather than a lesser one, that the desire to inhabit characters and tell stories from a stage was something a Kelly could pursue without shame. In a family where shame was a powerful organizing force, where the expectations of the church and the expectations of her father and the expectations of Philadelphia Catholic society all converged on a fairly narrow definition of what a respectable young woman should want, that permission mattered enormously. It planted something that could not be unplanted. Elizabeth Ann Kelly, born June 25, 1933, was the youngest of the four, and in the Kelly family, the youngest occupied a particular position. By the time Lausanne arrived, the dynamics were established, the shapes set, the roles already distributed. She arrived into a world where Peggy was already the favorite, Kel the athletic heir, and Grace the complicated middle child who didn't quite fit the pattern. Lausanne was simply the baby. The one everyone adored for being the last one. The one who benefited from a slightly relaxed grip. The one for whom the performance pressure was real, but not quite as overwhelming as it had been for the children who came before her. She was athletic, warm, and funny, in the way that youngest children in large competitive families often are. Having learned early to read the room, to find the tone that makes people smile, to be the one who keeps the peace and earns the affection through warmth rather than achievement. By temperament, she was perfectly suited to the life she would eventually build. From East Falls to the Academy, Grace's escape. Grace graduated from the Stevens School in Philadelphia in May 1947 and promptly left for New York, enrolling at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Her parents did not support the move financially. She would have to pay for her training and her living expenses herself. And she did, beginning almost immediately, through modeling. She signed with the Natalie Nickerson Agency and began appearing in cigarette advertisements and magazine spreads, the commercial work that was available in post-war New York to a young woman with her particular combination of looks and composure. She appeared on the cover of Cosmopolitan. She appeared in advertisements for Old Gold cigarettes, for Ipana toothpaste, for suntan lotion and soap, and the full inventory of consumer products that needed a face that was elegant without being unapproachable, polished without being cold, beautiful in a way that invited rather than excluded. The modeling paid for the acting lessons, and the acting lessons at the American Academy on West 56th Street began to give shape to what had previously been an instinct. The Academy was one of the oldest and most respected conservatories in the country, with alumni including Spencer Tracy, Kirk Douglas, Anne Bancroft, and Lauren Bacall. Grace studied there with the quiet intensity she brought to everything she cared about. She was not the most technically accomplished student in her class. She was not the most extroverted or the most theatrical in the conventional sense. But she had something that the best teachers in the conservatory tradition learned to recognize and value above nearly everything else. She was genuinely present when she performed. She listened. She responded. She was not performing at you or for you. She was living alongside you. Inside the scene, inside the moment. That quality, which cannot be taught and can only be developed from an interior life rich enough to draw from, was already fully formed in the quiet Kelly girl from East Falls. She made her Broadway debut in 1949 in Strindberg's The Father, a sufficiently significant production to earn her notices and establish her as a presence in New York theater circles. Her first film role came in 1951 in 14 Hours, a small part, more or less a face in a scene, but the camera noticed her in the way that cameras sometimes notice certain faces before the audience has any particular reason to. She was 22. She had appeared in one film, and she was about to be cast in a role that would transform her career with a speed that surprised even the people around her. High Noon came out in 1952, starred Gary Cooper as a sheriff who stands alone against a gang of killers, while the town he has protected abandons him, and changed the landscape of American cinema. Grace played Amy Fowler Kane, his new Quaker wife, a woman who has asked him to leave his gun behind and come away with her to build a life in peace. A woman whose pacifist convictions are tested by the violence of the world she married into. It was modest in terms of screen time, but crucial in terms of thematic weight, and Grace played it with a still, watchful quality that was perfectly calibrated to the film's emotional register. Stanley Kramer, the producer, said later that from the moment she walked onto the set, he knew she was going to be a star. He described a quality that is difficult to articulate, but that everyone in the film industry recognizes immediately when they encounter it. The camera's relationship with certain faces is simply different. It sees some people accurately and renders them clearly. It sees others and reveals something in them that is larger and more interior than what the eye alone can perceive. Grace Kelly was one of the second kind. The camera loved her in the specific way it loves, perhaps, one actress in a generation. What happened next happened very fast. Within 3 years of her film debut, Grace Kelly was one of the biggest names in Hollywood, working repeatedly with Alfred Hitchcock, who had identified in her something he had been looking for throughout his career. He cast her in Dial M for Murder in 1953, in which she played Margaret Wendis, a wife whose husband plots to have her killed, and Grace brought to the role a combination of physical composure and interior terror that gave the thriller its human weight. For The Country Girl, also made in 1954, she played Georgie Elgin, a woman married to a failing alcoholic actor played by Bing Crosby. A role that required her to be deliberately unglamorous, deliberately worn, deliberately stripped of the composed elegance that had been becoming her signature. She did it with a craft and an honesty that earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress in March 1955. She also appeared that year in To Catch a Thief, filmed on the French Riviera with Cary Grant, a romantic thriller in which the gorgeous coastal landscape that would become her permanent home served as backdrop, though nobody in the cast or crew knew that yet. Cary Grant became one of her closest friends after To Catch a Thief. He was, by his own accounting, someone who had worked with most of the great actresses of his generation and who found in Grace Kelly something that set her apart from all of them. A quality of genuine human warmth, combined with total professional mastery that was extraordinarily rare, that made her both a pleasure to work with and a genuine artistic equal. He said in interviews, consistently and over many years, that she was his favorite person he had ever worked with. He cried at her wedding. He cried at her funeral. He died in 1986, 4 years after her, and those who knew him said the years between were marked by a sadness about her, specifically, that had not been there before her death. On the night Grace won her Oscar in March 1955, Jack Kelly was in Philadelphia. He reportedly told friends that of all his children, Grace was the last one he would have expected to amount to much. It was, in the Kelly family tradition, a backhanded acknowledgement of spectacular proportions, a recognition of real achievement wrapped in the implication that he had not previously considered her capable of it. Grace, when she heard the remark, which she did, was not surprised. She had spent her entire childhood and young adulthood understanding that her father's approval would arrive, when it arrived at all, in forms that most people would not immediately recognize as approval. She had learned to receive it in the form it came and to love him regardless of the form. She was also, in that moment of peak Hollywood success, already moving toward the next chapter of her life. Because in Cannes, during the film festival of May 1955, a meeting had been arranged at the Palace of Monaco that would end her film career, transform her into something the world had never quite seen before, and set in motion a series of events that would affect not just Grace but every member of the family she was leaving behind. The Prince and his need. Rainier Louis Henri Maxence Bertrand Grimaldi was born May 31, 1923, and inherited the throne of Monaco in 1949 upon the death of his grandfather, Prince Louis II. He was 26 years old when he became the ruler of a principality of roughly 18,000 people on a stretch of Mediterranean coastline measuring less than 2 square kilometers in total. A territory so small that the comparison to Central Park in New York is not merely a rhetorical flourish, but an accurate geographical fact. Monaco is genuinely smaller than Central Park. Monaco's economy rested on its casino, the legendary Casino de Monte Carlo, which had been the playground of European aristocracy since the 19th century, and on its status as a tax haven that attracted wealthy residents from across the continent. By the early 1950s, both were under pressure. The casino was losing business to new gambling establishments across the French border. The principality's finances were stretched. And Rainier faced a problem that went beyond finances and into the constitutional survival of everything the Grimaldi family had built. According to Monaco's constitution, if Rainier died without a legitimate heir, the principality would revert to France and cease to exist as an independent state. The Grimaldi dynasty, which had survived wars and revolutions across more than 6 centuries of European history, would be extinguished not by conquest, but by the simple biological failure to produce a successor. Rainier had been involved with the French actress Gisèle Pascal for several years before Grace. The relationship was serious enough to be widely expected to end in marriage. It did not, partly because of invasive and reportedly unfounded concerns at the palace about Pascal's capacity to provide an heir, and partly because of the dynamics within Monaco's ruling circles, which had complex views about a sovereign prince marrying an actress. The irony of those concerns, given who Rainier eventually married, is not lost in retrospect. What Monaco needed was a high-profile wife who could restore the principality's glamour on the global stage, attract press, attract tourists, attract investment. The idea that a Hollywood actress of the first rank might accomplish what a European aristocrat could not was radical in concept and ruthlessly practical in its logic. It acknowledged something the old world was still learning about the post-war order. Celebrity was a currency as powerful as noble blood, and in some contexts more powerful because it traveled across borders and language barriers in ways that ancient titles simply did not. The meeting between Grace and Rainier was arranged through the intermediary of the journalist Pierre Gallant, organized around the Cannes Film Festival of May 1955, where Grace was attending as part of the American delegation. On the afternoon of May 6th, a photo session was arranged at the Prince's Palace of Monaco. Grace arrived in a floral dress she had not had time to press, her hair still damp from washing and improvised into an updo, using artificial flowers from a hotel room arrangement, because there was no time for anything more considered. She looked, in the photographs published in Paris Match, like a woman who had put herself together at short notice and had done it extraordinarily well. Rainier showed her around the palace gardens. They talked, politely, in the way of people who have been arranged to meet and who are not yet sure what they think of each other. Grace was composed, and not especially struck, at least not in any way she expressed at the time. But he wrote to her afterward. Regularly, over the following months, letters that began formally and became progressively less so, letters that those who have seen them describe as thoughtful and revealing, the letters of a man making a genuine effort to present himself at his best to a woman he found truly compelling. Grace was corresponding with other men during this period. She was not without romantic possibilities or romantic history, but Rainier's letters had a persistence and an attentiveness that she found apparently more interesting than she had expected from a European prince. He sailed to the United States on his yacht in December 1955 and arrived at 3901 Henry Avenue on Christmas Day. He met the family. He proposed to Grace. She said yes. She was 26 years old. She was at the absolute peak of her career. She had just won an Academy Award. She was one of the most sought-after women in the world. And she was saying yes to a man she had met 5 months ago, spent perhaps 6 hours with in person, and corresponded with by letter. She was saying yes to a life in a country of 18,000 people where she did not yet speak the language fluently, where she would be required to give up her film career, where she would be subject to the protocols of a court that had its own established and deeply entrenched ideas about what a princess was and how she was supposed to behave. She believed, as people in these moments always believe, that the things that were difficult could be managed, that the things that were uncertain would resolve, that the title and the palace and the ancient family with its centuries of accumulated protocol was a context she could learn to inhabit without losing herself. She was not entirely wrong, but she was not entirely right either. The dowry and the wedding of the century. The engagement was announced formally on January 5, 1956, at a press conference at the Kelly family home on Henry Avenue. The world responded with the particular delirious excitement that the combination of Hollywood and European royalty has always produced in the popular imagination. It was, even before it happened, already a fairy tale, already a story that the culture needed and was going to consume. What was not announced was the financial arrangement negotiated before the public knew anything about it. The Kelly family was required to provide a dowry of $2 million to the House of Grimaldi. This was not unusual in the context of European noble families, where dowries remained a practical reality in the mid-20th century, though the concept had largely faded from American practice. But for Jack Kelly, a man who had built everything he had from nothing, and who had spent his life proving that no one could make him pay for access to rooms he deserved to enter, the requirement sat in a complicated way. He reportedly told anyone who would listen that his daughter didn't need to pay any man to marry her. He was not wrong about that in any moral sense. He was wrong in the practical sense that Grace wanted this marriage and the terms were what they were, set by the Grimaldi family as a condition of their agreement. Eventually, as fathers of daughters who know their own minds tend to do, he relented. $1 million of the dowry came from Grace's own earnings, from the modeling fees and film salaries accumulated over 7 years of working first in New York and then in Hollywood. She was paying for her own marriage out of money she had earned herself, money that represented years of the discipline and work that her father had doubted she was capable of. She was, in other words, buying her way into the palace with the proceeds of the very career he had dismissed. The other $1 million came from the Kelly family fortune, from the bricklaying money, from the construction contracts, from the sweat and strategy of a man who had built his empire from nothing so that his children would never have to struggle the way he had. Now that money was crossing the Atlantic to a European principality to make his daughter's marriage to a prince possible. The wedding took place over 2 days. The civil ceremony in the throne room of the prince's palace on April 18, 1956. The religious ceremony at St. Nicholas Cathedral the following day, April 19th. The dress was designed by MGM's costume designer Helen Rose and given to Grace by the studio in exchange for broadcast rights to the ceremonies. It was made from 125-year-old Brussels lace, ivory silk taffeta, silk fail, and thousands of individually hand-sewn seed pearls. The bodice was constructed from antique rose point lace, so delicate it could not be touched by bare hands during construction. It took 6 weeks and 36 seamstresses to complete. 35 years later, the Metropolitan Museum of Art would display it as an object of historical and artistic significance. Fashion historians would study it as a synthesis of contradictions, simultaneously restrained and extravagant, Hollywood and European, deeply American and deeply of the old world. 30 million people watched on television. 900 reporters were on the ground in Monaco. 40,000 people lined the streets outside the cathedral. Cary Grant was in attendance, and by multiple accounts, wept. Prince Rainier said later that the two of them should have simply gone to a small chapel in the mountains and been married quietly. It was a remark that had the quality of something he genuinely meant, said by a man who found large public performances uncomfortable and who understood, perhaps better than Grace did in those early months, what this level of global attention would mean for the rest of their lives together. Grace Kelly was 26 years old. She walked into that cathedral in the most beautiful dress ever made, on her father's arm, while 30 million people watched. She became Her Serene Highness Princess Grace of Monaco. And she stepped through the door of that other life and let it close behind her. The film career was over. The New York apartment was gone. The modeling years, the acting classes, the Academy Award, the Hitchcock films, the freedom of a young woman in a city making her own way, all of it was behind the cathedral door. Meanwhile, Grace was discovering that the role of princess was both more demanding and more restrictive than she had fully allowed herself to anticipate before accepting it. Alfred Hitchcock approached her in 1962 about starring in Marnie, a complex psychological thriller with a role of real depth and challenge, precisely the kind of material she had always been most drawn to as an actress. She wanted to accept. Monaco's public opposition was immediate and intense. The role required depictions of sexuality they found inappropriate for a princess. There were protests in the principality. Rainier was opposed. Grace withdrew from the project. Tippi Hedren played Marnie instead, and the film became one of Hitchcock's most discussed and analyzed works. It cost Grace something real and irretrievable. Not just the role, but the confirmation that the creative life she had surrendered was not recoverable within the context she had chosen. She joined the board of 20th Century Fox in 1976. She narrated documentaries. She gave poetry readings on stages across Europe in her later years, bringing the full resources of a trained actress's craft to the interpretive challenge of performing other people's poetry in front of live audiences. Those who attended those readings consistently reported something beyond what they had expected. Not a princess reading poems, but an actress using everything she had ever learned to make someone else's words live in real time and in public space. The actress had not been replaced by the princess. She had been waiting for a stage that fit the new circumstances. She pressed flowers and published a book about them in 1980, My Book of Flowers, which revealed to those who came to it with attention a sensibility of real refinement and poetic intelligence. She established the Princess Grace Foundation to support emerging artists in the United States, an organization that continues operating today, having supported thousands of young artists across disciplines through grants and fellowships in the decades since her death. She became president of the Red Cross of Monaco and transformed it into a genuinely significant humanitarian organization. She founded Amade Mondiale in 1963, focused on children's rights and welfare. After witnessing the conditions of refugee children in Southeast Asia, and the organization eventually achieved United Nations recognition. She was genuinely good at all of this, and this matters because it could easily have been otherwise. The combination of public profile, organizational intelligence, and authentic commitment to the causes she had chosen made her an effective advocate in ways that went beyond the ceremonial gestures that famous patrons often mistake for philanthropy. She showed up, she had read the materials, she expected the same from everyone else. But Monaco was a small world, and the marriage was not without its costs. Rainier could be brusque and controlling, a man whose upbringing and his role had shaped him to make decisions and enforce them, to have strong views about how his wife should present herself and what she should and should not do with the creative ambitions she had brought from Philadelphia and Hollywood. They argued. There were periods of distance that those close to them recognized and understood without discussing openly. There were also, by the same accounts, periods of genuine warmth, times when the differences fell away and what remained was the friendship that can develop between two people who have spent decades building a shared life. Grace also missed, with an ache that she could not always conceal from the people closest to her, the creative community she had left behind. The world of Hitchcock and Grant and Stewart and the perpetual stimulating exchange of a film industry at the height of its golden age was not replaceable by any combination of charity work and poetry readings, however genuine and however skilled. She had been a working artist among working artists, and Monaco, however beautiful, however historic, however full of obligation and purpose, was not that. She never expressed public regret about the choice. That would have been both a betrayal of her children, who were the direct result of that choice, and a violation of her own standards of dignity. But those close to her have consistently reported that the years did not smooth away entirely the complicated texture of what she had agreed to. Peggy, the sister who stayed. While Grace was learning to be a princess in Monaco, Peggy Kelly was living her life in Philadelphia, and her life was not going the way anyone had expected. Margaret Catherine Kelly, the eldest daughter, the brightest social star, the one her father had always favored most openly, married George Leland Davis Jr. in the early 1950s. Davis came from a family of compatible social standing, and the marriage had all the markers of the kind of suitable, well-arranged union that Philadelphia Catholic society approved of. They had children, twin girls named Margaret and Mary Lee. They had a house. They had a position in the social world of a city that took its social world very seriously. And then the marriage fell apart. George and Peggy Kelly Davis divorced in 1959. Peggy was 34 years old. In 1959, divorce carried a social weight that is difficult to fully appreciate from the perspective of decades later. Among the Irish Catholic families of Philadelphia, where the Church's position on the permanence of marriage was not a formality, but an organizing moral reality, divorce was not merely a legal dissolution. It was a public declaration that something essential had broken in a way that the faith considered irreparable. The Kelly family was Catholic to its marrow. The neighborhood, the schools, the social networks, the charities, the political world were all organized around the church and its expectations. A divorced woman in that world had her standing measurably and practically diminished. People adjusted how they looked at you. Invitations changed. The social calculus shifted in ways that were real and daily and impossible to ignore. Peggy would have understood this, not as an abstraction, but as a series of concrete moments in a life that had previously been conducted on very different terms. The contrast with her younger sister's circumstances was not subtle, and it was not neutral. Peggy remarried to a man named Eugene Conlon in the years following her first divorce, in the spirit of hope and determination that people bring to second chances. The Conlon marriage also ended. 2 marriages. 2 divorces. In a world where 1 divorce was a misfortune and 2 were a pattern, Peggy Kelly had acquired a history that the social world she moved in could not entirely set aside. She also had 2 daughters to raise, Margaret and Mary Lee, in circumstances that were, by the 1960s, significantly more complicated than anyone in the family had anticipated when those girls were born. She raised them as best she could, with the resources she had, in a Philadelphia that was still measuring her by standards she could no longer meet. By the mid-1960s, the accumulated weight of all of that was beginning to show. The drinking had become serious. Not the social drinking of a woman who enjoyed a good party, which would have been entirely within the norms of the Philadelphia world she moved in, but the purposeful, self-medicating drinking of a woman who has found that the distance it creates between herself and her pain is the only kind of distance currently available to her. The people around her understood this in the way people always understand alcoholism in someone they love, slowly, imperfectly, with too much rationalizing and too much hope that it will resolve itself, and then with grief when it doesn't resolve but deepens. She continued to show up. She maintained a role as vice president of the Red Cross of Monaco, alongside Grace and Princess Antoinette, which gave her a connection to the official life of the principality, even from Philadelphia. She attended the Kelly family gatherings, the Labor Day barbecues in Ocean City, the annual reunions that the family's powerful sense of its own identity required. She was present. But the Peggy who appeared at those events was, year by year, less and less the woman who had once been considered the most vibrant of all the Kelly children, the one everyone had expected to have the brilliant future. Eugene Conlon, her second husband, died on May 2, 1985. On the same day, by a coincidence so terrible it strains the imagination, her brother Jack Kelly Jr. collapsed while jogging along Kelly Drive in Philadelphia and died of a heart attack. He was 57 years old. He had been running, doing what the Kelly family had always done, pushing the body and refusing to slow down, and his heart had finally, after 57 years of performing at Kelly standards, refused. Kel died on the road named for the family. Peggy lost her husband and her brother on the same day. There are losses that can be absorbed, and there are losses that mark the end of a person's capacity to continue as they had been. It is not difficult to understand why the years between 1985 and 1991 were the most difficult of Peggy Kelly's already difficult life. Peggy Kelly Conlon died on November 23, 1991, in Philadelphia. She was 65 years old. The cause, as her obituary described it, was a long illness. Those who have written honestly about the Kelly family have not shied away from acknowledging that the long illness was substantially alcoholism, and that what killed Peggy Kelly was the accumulated weight of a life that had promised more than it delivered, and asked her to survive more than it helped her endure. Her obituary was gracious and careful in the way of obituaries written by people who loved someone and who chose to honor what was best about them. It noted that she had been generous with the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, that she had enjoyed swimming and diving, that people who had known both Peggy and Grace had considered Peggy the more beautiful of the two. It was the kind of obituary that carries its grief in the spaces between the words. Grace had been dead for 9 years by the time Peggy went. There were no cameras for Peggy's funeral, no 30 million people watching on television, no Paris match spread on the newsstands across Europe. There was Philadelphia, and there were the people who had known her when she was just the eldest Kelly girl, the one everyone expected to have the brilliant future, the one whose life became something else entirely. Lausanne, the grounded one, Elizabeth Ann Kelly, born June 25, 1933, was the Kelly who survived. Not merely the one who lived longest, though she was that, outlasting all 3 of her siblings. The one who survived in the deeper sense, who came through the storms without being fundamentally broken by them, who built something real and kept it real, and mourned her losses without being consumed by them. In a family that produced one of the most famous women in the world, one of the great American athletic dynasties, one of the more public unravelings of a life in a major American city, and one of the quietest steady dignities in the story's margins, Lausanne was the steady one. She grew up in the 17-room house on Henry Avenue as the youngest, absorbing the dynamics of a family whose shape was already established by the time she arrived old enough to observe it. She saw Peggy being favored and felt the warmth of that relationship without being consumed by the hierarchy it implied. She watched Kel being groomed for athletic greatness and understood what that grooming cost as well as what it produced. She watched Grace being the complicated middle child who didn't fit the pattern and who was working out in real time whether not fitting was a problem to be solved or a capacity to be developed. Lausanne absorbed all of it from the position of the one who was loved simply for being the baby, who was not yet required to be excellent, before she had figured out what excellence meant for her. She played field hockey with enough skill to captain the varsity team at the University of Pennsylvania, which required genuine competitive drive and real athletic talent, not the kind of participation certificate effort that gets remembered as athletic achievement. She appeared in the early issues of Sports Illustrated in 1955, photographed in her hockey uniform, one of the first women to appear in a magazine that would later become the defining publication of American sports culture. She was warm and funny and easy to be around in the way that youngest children often are, having learned early how to read a room and find the tone that makes people want to stay in it. She spent time with Grace on movie sets in the mid-1950s, serving as companion and chaperone during the Hitchcock productions, watching from a careful and loving distance as her sister's world became something neither of them could have anticipated when they were small. She was there on the set of Rear Window and To Catch a Thief, and she watched the director and the actress work together with the particular attention of someone who was witnessing the creation of something historic without quite knowing yet that was what it was. She saw what Grace was capable of when given the right material and the right direction, and she understood something about her sister that their father had taken much longer to understand. On June 25, 1955, her 22nd birthday, Lausanne married Donald Levine, a stockbroker who later became a thoroughbred horse trainer and racing official. Grace was her maid of honor. The following year, Lausanne was not at Grace's wedding in Monaco because she was 8 months pregnant with her first child. The timing had the comedy that real life sometimes has when it inserts itself into the grand narrative at the most inconvenient possible moment, and Lausanne was fine with it in the way that grounded people are fine with such things. Her priority was her child. When her daughter was born, she named her Grace after her sister. It was an act of simple and complete devotion, the kind of love that doesn't require announcement or ceremony. Donald's work in the racing world meant the family moved with the rhythms of the track calendar. Lausanne went with him, raising their children, son Christopher and daughter Grace, in the kind of life that athletic people who love each other sometimes build. Itinerant in its geography, deeply rooted in its values. She was a woman who could make a home in different places without losing herself, who carried her sense of who she was with her, rather than needing a particular address to define it. The marriage was, by every account from people who knew them, genuinely happy, in the basic and important sense that both people in it wanted to be there. They spent summers at the Kelly family's Ocean City, New Jersey beach property, continuing the traditions that Jack and Margaret had established when the children were young. The Labor Day barbecues, the body surfing competitions at 47th Street, which the Kellys had always approached with the same competitive seriousness they brought to everything. Because for the Kellys, there was no such thing as an activity that didn't reward being good at it. The annual family reunions. Even after Grace was a princess and the Kelly name had become one of the most recognizable in the world, Lausanne maintained those traditions with the straightforward devotion that characterized everything she did. Grace came back when she could, and when she did, she slipped back into the family orbit as naturally as if she had never left. As if the palace and the title and the 30 million television viewers were a dream she sometimes had, and this, the beach and the sister and the salt air, was the reality she came back to. What? The losses cost Lausanne. The losses came for Lausanne as they came for all the Kellys, and they came in numbers that tested the resilience she had spent her life building against exactly this possibility. Their father Jack died in June 1960 of intestinal cancer. He was 70 years old. The man who had built everything, who had mailed his racing cap to a king, who had paid $2 million to make his daughter a princess, while telling everyone in Philadelphia he hadn't needed to, was gone. The house on Henry Avenue and the stories continued, but the center of the myth was no longer there to inhabit it. Their mother Margaret outlived Jack by 30 years, surviving until 1990. She remained a formidable presence in the family across those decades, still Margaret Kelly in every way that mattered, even as a debilitating stroke in her later years compromised the physical and personal independence that had always defined her. Lausanne was there through that, as she was always there. Then 1982 brought the road above Monaco. The loss of Grace was a wound in the Kelly family that did not fully close. Lausanne had named her daughter after this woman. She had watched her become the most famous actress in the world, and then watched her become the most famous princess in the world, and had maintained the relationship through all of it, with the persistence and the love that real sibling bonds require across distance and changed circumstances, and the enormous gravitational force of celebrity that pulls everything toward it and leaves little room for the ordinary bonds of ordinary life. To lose Grace and then, in 1999, Lausanne's daughter Grace, the one named for her famous aunt, the one born in the year of the royal wedding, died of cancer at 43 years old. The death of a grown child is the reversal that no parent's internal architecture is built to withstand, and Lausanne absorbed it with the quiet fortitude she had always brought to difficulty. But it cost her profoundly and completely. Her husband Donald died the following year, 2000, at 72. In a single year, she had lost her daughter and her husband. By 2001, Lausanne Kelly Levine was the last surviving child of Jack and Margaret Kelly, the last of the four, the last of the Kellys of that generation. the one who had watched all of it happen, who had been present for the Olympic gold medals and the Academy Award and the royal wedding and the funeral in the cathedral and the long, quiet undoing of Peggy's life and the final summer at Rockagel and all of it, and who was now the only one left to remember any of it from the inside. She moved into a retirement community in Haverford, Pennsylvania, where she continued to be active in charitable work, maintained the friendships she had built over a lifetime, and was described by those around her as warm and funny and completely herself. Not diminished by the losses, though the losses were enormous. Not hardened by them, though they would have hardened many people. Simply herself, carrying everything she had witnessed with a dignity that never required a camera to document it. Lausanne Kelly Levine died on November 24, 2009. She was 76 years old. Cancer took her, as it had taken her daughter Grace a decade before. Her nephew Prince Albert II of Monaco attended the funeral at St. Bridget's Church in East Falls, the same neighborhood where the whole story had begun 80 years before. The same church where Grace had grown up. It was a graceful, proper Philadelphia farewell. No cameras of international significance, no global television audience, no journalists filing copy from the church steps. There was family, and there were the people who had known her when she was simply the youngest Kelly girl, the baby of the family, the one who had watched everything happen from the position of the one who stayed on the ground, who stayed herself, who built a life that was genuinely hers. She was, by most measures, the one who got through it best. Not because she was luckier. She had seen as much loss as any of them, perhaps more than any of them. She had buried her father and her mother and her sister Grace and her brother Kel and her sister Peggy and her own daughter and her husband. She had been the last one standing at every stage of a story that ran for most of a century. But she had not been dragged into fame's undertow the way Grace had, and she had not been left behind by it the way Peggy was. She had found a life that was genuinely hers, had loved the people in it thoroughly, and had mourned them when they went with a dignity that never needed anyone else to witness it, to make it real. Grace had spent the summer of 1982 at Rockagel, the family's farmhouse retreat in the hills just over the French border above Monaco. It was a place she loved for the reason that people who live entirely public lives love private retreats. It was simple, it was quiet, it was a place where the protocol relaxed and the family could be something closer to itself. The gardens she tended there, the flowers she pressed, the evenings that were not state dinners, the mornings that were not official schedules. All of it represented the version of her Monaco life that she had managed to carve out against the pressure of the public one. The summer had been full. It had been, by Caroline's later account, exhausting in ways that Grace had not allowed to slow her down, because slowing down was not something Grace Kelly permitted herself. She had been preparing for the autumn season of events, working on various projects, attending to the obligations of a life that had very few moments of genuine emptiness. On the morning of September 13, 1982, Grace was driving back to Monaco from Rockagel in her 1972 Rover 3500. Stephanie, 17 years old, and due to begin studies in Paris, was in the passenger seat. They were carrying luggage. The car was too small to accommodate both of them, their bags, and a driver simultaneously, and so Grace took the wheel herself. Grace Kelly did not enjoy driving. This is reported consistently by those who knew her well. She had been in a minor accident in Monaco in the 1970s and had afterward expressed a preference for being driven. She was aware of her unease on the mountain roads above the Principality. Roads that are genuinely treacherous, narrow, winding through the hills with sudden sharp curves and precipitous drops on one side and exposed rock face on the other. The D37 from Rockagel down to Monaco is one of those roads. It is beautiful in the way that many roads on the Côte d'Azur are beautiful. And it is dangerous in the way that narrow mountain roads built for earlier traffic in an earlier era are always dangerous. A witness driving behind the Rover that morning later told investigators that he had been following at a normal distance when the car began behaving strangely. It swerved violently across both lanes, then it seemed to correct itself, to straighten. Then it accelerated hard into the bend ahead. There were no brake lights. The rover did not slow down. It went off the road and fell approximately 30 meters, roughly 100 feet, tumbling down the hillside. Stephanie was conscious when rescuers reached the wreckage. She had a fractured vertebra, a concussion, and other injuries. She was alive. She was 17 years old, and she had just survived an accident that had killed her mother, and she would carry the weight of that fact in the specific way that only she could carry it, which was unlike anyone else's grief, which was her own entirely. Grace was found with severe brain injuries, injuries to her chest, and a fractured femur. She was unconscious. She was extracted from the car and taken by ambulance to Monaco's hospital. The palace issued a careful statement suggesting broken bones and cautious optimism. The doctors were not optimistic. What the medical team understood almost immediately upon her arrival was that Grace had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, a catastrophic bleed inside the brain, and that the hemorrhage had almost certainly begun before the car went off the road. The loss of consciousness from the hemorrhage was what caused her to lose control. The crash had not caused the hemorrhage. The hemorrhage had caused the crash. As she lay in the hospital, a second and more severe hemorrhage struck. The damage to her brain was assessed as irreversible. There was no recovery possible from what had happened inside her skull on the D-37 above Monaco that September morning. Prince Rainier, with Caroline and Albert, made the decision to remove her from life support. At 10:55 in the evening on September 14, 1982, Grace Patricia Kelly died. She was 52 years old. She had been Princess of Monaco for 26 years. She had been an actress, a model, a bricklayer's granddaughter, an Academy Award winner, a mother of three, the most famous woman in the world for a period, and a woman who had pressed flowers in a farmhouse above Monaco because she needed something that was entirely her own. The palace's communications in the hours between the accident and her death were later criticized because the gap between the official statements of cautious optimism and what the doctors actually knew was real. Whether that gap reflected the palace's instinct for controlling the narrative, or the simply human impulse to hope a little longer than the evidence warranted, it was noticed when the full truth emerged. But it was quickly overtaken by the simple and enormous fact of what had been lost. The funeral was held on September 18, 1982, at St. Nicholas Cathedral in Monaco. The same cathedral where she had been married 26 years earlier. The same cathedral where her children had been baptized. The same cathedral she had entered in that extraordinary dress while the world held its breath. Close to 100 million people watched on television. Cary Grant, who attended, was devastated in a way that those around him described as lasting until his own death 4 years later. James Stewart, who could not attend, but who was asked about Grace Kelly in the days following her death, said that he loved her not because she was a princess or an actress or his friend, but because she was simply the nicest person he had ever met, and that every time he saw her had been a kind of holiday. Stephanie was still in the hospital, still recovering from her own injuries when the funeral took place in the cathedral below. She could not attend. She lay in a hospital bed while 100 million people gathered in the cathedral to say goodbye to the woman who had been driving. The public speculation about the accident was real, and it was sometimes cruel, turning toward Stephanie in the way that grief's need to assign blame sometimes turns toward the nearest available target. She did not deserve the speculation. The medical evidence was clear. The hemorrhage caused the accident. Nothing Stephanie did or did not do had any bearing on what happened on that road. But grief is not always reasonable in how it distributes itself. And the need to make sense of something senseless is one of the oldest and least admirable of human impulses. Stephanie spent years carrying what she called the impossible burden of having survived, of mourning in public while the public watched, of being 17 years old and responsible for nothing, and somehow made to feel responsible for everything. She did not deserve any of it. She deserved to be allowed to grieve her mother privately, and she was denied that in ways that cost her something real. Prince Rainier never remarried. He continued to rule Monaco for 23 more years, a man profoundly changed, in ways those close to him described as fundamental, by the loss of the woman who had shared his life for 26 years. He died in April 2005 at 81 and was buried beside Grace in the cathedral crypt, in the place that had been waiting for him. What the Kelly family leaves behind. The Kelly family of Philadelphia produced, in the course of 3 generations, a record of achievement so compressed and varied as to be almost fictional in its dimensions. 3 Olympic gold medals in rowing, an Academy Award for acting, a Pulitzer Prize in drama, a royal title in one of Europe's most ancient dynasties, a bronze Olympic medal, presidencies of national and international organizations, a stretch of road along the Schuylkill River named for them while they were still alive to see it. They also produced a daughter who drank herself slowly into the ground while the world celebrated her sister. A son who died of a heart attack jogging on the road that bore the family's name at 57 years old. A princess who died on a mountain road before she was old enough to fully inhabit the life she had built. And the youngest, who outlasted all of them, who buried her daughter and her husband in the same year and got up the next morning anyway, and who carried everything she had witnessed with a dignity that never needed a camera to make it real. Jack Kelly wanted his children to be excellent. They were excellent. They were also human, which is to say they were vulnerable and complicated and capable of being broken by things that excellence cannot protect against. The illness that does not care about your Olympic medals. The grief that does not care about your Oscar. The alcoholism that does not care about your famous sister's palace on a rock above the Mediterranean. The hemorrhage that does not care about the road you've driven 100 times before and know like the back of your hand. The grandeur and the grief lived side by side, as they always do when you look closely enough at any family. The Kellys just happen to live theirs on a stage large enough that we can all see both, if we choose to look. It is worth returning one final time to the photograph from April 1956, the photograph that has never stopped circulating. The young woman in the gown walking toward the altar. She looked like she had stepped out of a storybook, and the storybook was only part of the story. There were 3 sisters in that Philadelphia family. One became a princess. The others lived lives just as dramatic, and in the end, just as worthy of being known. That is the full picture. That is the story this has tried to tell. If you found this story worth your time, please like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another one. The stories behind the stories. The full picture. The human beings inside the legends. We will see you for the next one.